Thank you for joining us for the launch of the Institute's Global Status of CCS Report 2024. My name's Alex Apandis. I'm the General Manager External Affairs here at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. And as a brief introduction for those of you who may not be familiar with what the Institute is, we are a global think tank with a mission of accelerating the deployment of carbon capture and storage as an essential technology to tackle climate change. Each year, we produce a comprehensive report on the global status of CCS that tracks developments over the past 12 months. And there's certainly been lots of developments over the past year. But before I start, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which our Australian team spread out across the continent as we live and work. And I extend my respects to elders past and present. Next slide, please, Preeta. So today we'll hear from CCS proponents from across the Asia Pacific region. We'll start with pre-recorded remarks from His Excellency Mr. Rafizi Ramli, who's the Minister for Economy in Malaysia. Very fortunate to have received remarks from him. We thank him for that. We're also very excited to be joined by a panel of industry leaders who will share their insights and experiences. They include Rosie Johnstone, who's Head of CCS Solutions at GeoVault and Chair of the Carbon Capture Utilisation Storage Network Australia, Scott Nielsen, who's a partner in A&O Shearman, which is a leading international law firm, very active in CCS, particularly in this region, and Takashi Hongo, who's a senior fellow at the prestigious Mitsui and Company Global Strategic Studies Institute in Japan. I must also pass on my apologies from Jared Daniels, who's our CEO. He had planned to be with us today to make some opening remarks, but personal circumstances have prevented him from being able to join us. So a couple of housekeeping points. Please note that we'll be taking questions from the audience during our panel discussion at the end of the presentation. So please submit any questions you might have via the Q&A function. You'll see that at the bottom of the screen. If you put your cursor at the bottom of the screen, submit questions in the Q&A function, not the chat function, please. Next slide, please, Preeta. So now let's hear from His Excellency Rafizi Ramli, who's the Minister for Economy in Malaysia.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to congratulate the Global CCS Institute for the launching of the Global Status of CCS Report 2024 today. The Institute's continuous effort in providing insights and updates of the CCS deployment progress around the world through the publication of this report should be applauded. The global pursuit of a net zero future is not just contingent on trillions of investments going into climate mitigation projects. Much of the tension lies in there being sufficient regulatory support, but also a plausible economic argument for take-up. While it is a priority for many to decarbonize quickly, it must be done in a manner that can bring tangible impact and growth to our economy. The road to feasibly meeting net zero in 2050 requires the deployment of CCUS. It is difficult to think of a solution that can scale and meet the decarbonization demands of industries. However, rationalizing the sizable capital costs at this nascent stage often lies in regulatory support. Governments have to take a high vantage point in legislation for businesses to make the risk economics work for their corporate plannings. Hence, Malaysia's commitment to creating that framework. Malaysia will be tabling its standalone CCUS bill in Parliament in November this year. We are sprinting because we recognize our edge in being a regional CCS hub, not just for ASEAN, but the entire Asia-Pacific community. Malaysia is unique in not just having high-quality storage sites, but the corresponding quality in expertise to realize gains. We want to leverage this to provide an integrated CCUS solution for industries in Asia-Pacific, the first of its kind. Malaysia's vision of being a successful hub relies on greater regional cooperation. By harnessing the collective transportation infrastructure from every participating country, we can support faster deployment. This will reduce the per-unit cost of CCUS deployment and facilitate uptake. As Malaysia takes the ASEAN Chairmanship in 2025, CCUS will be a cornerstone example of our philosophy on economic integration, how the repurposing of dated oil sites can generate an entirely new industry, and how that industry can grow exponentially if we share our infrastructure and are in lockstep. I believe we are able to establish this rising industry. Malaysia and participating countries will pioneer a new economic paradigm, one that balances economic interests with a desire to achieve net zero. With that, I once again congratulate the Institute for today's report launching, and may this be another stepping stone to unlock CCUS possibilities. Thank you.
Well, our thanks very much go to His Excellency Rafizi Rumli for those insightful remarks. I think there's a lot to take away from those remarks. The recognition of the fact that Malaysia and other countries is now looking at CCS, not only in terms of its value with respect to reducing emissions, but also as the source of new industry, marries up that need to continue economic development whilst meeting the urgent challenge of climate change. Okay, let's now dive into this year's report. We're on slide 6, so thank you very much. Next slide, please, Preeta. So this year's report, Collaborating for a Net Zero Future, emphasises the power of global collaboration as governments and industry around the world work together toward the shared common goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and reaching net zero as quickly as possible. Achieving the objective of the Paris Agreement to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires greenhouse gas emissions to reduce to net zero by around the middle of this century, which is only about 25 years away. The essential contribution of CCS in achieving that goal through both emission reductions at source and removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is now broadly recognised, and collaboration is driving industry growth. There are now a number of collaborative forums around the world, including the Clean Energy Ministerial, Mission Innovation, the Carbon Management Challenge, and the Asia CCUS Network, which are proving incredibly useful in raising ambition and sharing knowledge. The Industrial Carbon Management Strategy, adopted by the European Commission in early 2024, is also an outstanding example of government collaboration to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture and storage through initiatives across policy, infrastructure investment, regulation, carbon accounting, and of course, research. Beyond that, government-to-government agreements, or MOUs, Memoranda of Understanding, which are particularly important for the development of cross-border value chains, are being put in place, highlighting an acceleration in intergovernmental collaboration. The Institute has identified over 50 bilateral agreements or Memoranda of Understanding executed by national governments since 2020 that include carbon capture and storage within their scope. No doubt there are more that have been developed since we finalised the text of the status report. There are also many strong examples of public-private partnerships to develop carbon capture and storage facilities emerging in all jurisdictions. Just to name a couple of examples, in Saudi Arabia, the Energy Ministry has signed a joint development agreement with Saudi Aramco, SLB, and Linde to establish a CCUS hub at Jubail with the capacity to store up to 9 million tonnes per annum of carbon dioxide later this decade. In Asia, the Shepherd CCS project is a standout. It's a collaboration between the Malaysian and South Korean governments, working with a range of companies to establish a cross-border CCS project. Private sector cooperation continues to leverage the diversity of competencies across the value chain. There are many examples of technology companies, shipping companies, resource companies, ports, and heavy industry, all working together under agreements or in joint ventures to develop CCS projects or technologies. And this collaboration is essential, and it is accelerating technical and business model innovation relevant to CCS. Next slide, please. Despite a relatively challenging year for low carbon investments around the world, 2024 has seen significant growth in the CCS facility pipeline. As of July this year, which is when we close off the data for the status report, there were 628 projects in the project pipeline across all stages of development and operation. This represents a 60% year-on-year increase in the number of projects. The entire project pipeline now has a total capture capacity of 416 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year, which represents a 32% compound average growth rate over the last 7 years. Pretty impressive and sustained growth. Breaking down the project in the pipeline, there are 50 commercial CCS facilities now in operation around the world. There are 44 in construction. There are 247 that are in advanced development. So what that means is for capture facilities, that means that these projects are completing or have completed front-end engineering and design. And this is more than a doubling of the number since last year's report. The storage site, advanced development, means that the proponent is completing a submission or has submitted a field development plan or equivalent to regulators. This progress signifies a notable step toward construction, entailing substantial engineering funding and commitment levels. And there are a further 287 projects that are in early development stages. These are projects which are completing or have completed pre-feasibility or feasibility studies. And there are actually more projects than that we call announced, that we haven't yet vetted, but aren't yet contributing to the statistics that are reported here today or in the report. I think most significantly, though, as can be seen from the stacked bar furthest to the right of screen, the total capture capacity of operating facilities is on track to double to over 100 million tonnes per annum when the facilities that are currently being built today begin operations over the next several years. Next slide, please, Preeta. And almost all of that capacity under construction, which is shown by the cyan or the greeny coloured circles on this chart, is expected to come online by 2030. This chart shows the growth and the increasing diversity of applications of carbon capture and storage across industries. The first operating projects at the left of the timeline were in natural gas processing, ethanol, and hydrogen or fertilizer production, all applications where the cost of capture is relatively low. But as time progresses, we're seeing more projects are being developed in industries where the cost of capture is higher, including the highest cost application, direct air capture of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, shown at the top of this chart. And we continue to observe strong growth in the number of transport and storage projects which do not include an associated capture facility. These have more than doubled to 222 projects in the last year, underscoring the predominance of the network model for deployment and the anticipated future market for carbon dioxide transport and storage services, which is incentivizing quite a lot of investment. This growth is being driven ultimately by strengthening policy as governments increase their efforts to meet their net zero targets. Next slide, please, Preeta. Now, as I just intimated, policy does indeed drive growth. This year's report highlights that we are seeing strong support for CCS through international and multilateral policy initiatives. CCS has been included in the global stocktake as a key technology for reducing emissions in hard-to-abate sectors. Some of the upcoming nationally determined contributions due in February of 2025 are expected to increase CCS investment plans. And as already mentioned, multilateral initiatives such as the Clean Energy Ministerial, Mission Innovation, Carbon Management Challenge, and the Asia CCUS Network are raising ambition, as well as accelerating innovation through knowledge sharing. In addition to strengthening policy to drive investment in CCS, governments around the world are developing or improving CCS-specific regulation. For first movers with existing regimes, the focus has been on expansion, refinement, completion, and implementation. For example, the US Environment Protection Agency is reviewing applications for over 100 carbon dioxide injection wells for geological storage. In Europe and the UK, regulators are building on their early legal and regulatory frameworks and refining permitting processes to align with project experience and to allow the implementation of transboundary CCS value chains. In Australia, the government introduced legislation to create a new permit regime for the import and export of CO2 to meet London Protocol obligations. In jurisdictions spanning the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and South America, regulators are developing CCS legislation, often for the first time, and the regulation to support deployment. In the APAC region, where the focus is on enabling transboundary CCS value chains, legal and regulatory frameworks are being developed to facilitate hub development and to enable carbon dioxide import and export for geological storage. Next slide, please. As we've discussed already, substantial momentum for carbon capture and storage around the world has been built on the back of good policy making. In the current financial climate, project de-risking in the form of long-term direct or indirect public support remains key to investments in CCS. However, we've seen the benefits of strengthened policy partially offset over the past 12 months by cost inflation, rising interest rates, permitting challenges, and political uncertainty in some jurisdictions. This means that the spike in projects might be showing signs of slowing down. Notable examples are some of the delays and cancellations we've seen of carbon dioxide pipelines and hydrogen projects in the United States. Projects in the US, in the European Union, Canada, and the Middle East demonstrate that without a mandate or firm carbon price, CCS projects must rely on public sector support through grants, low-cost loans, or operational subsidies. But despite these challenges, there are several potential tailwinds that might actually assist with CCS financing. The need for reliable baseload power, particularly for AI data centers, and the demand for high quality carbon credits could present as a tailwind for CCS. We're starting to see the early signs there. The demand for high quality removal credits, this initially started with direct air capture with geological storage, has since evolved to also include bioenergy with CCS projects. Increasing multilateral development bank support for CCS could fund critical activities like legislation development, carbon dioxide storage assessments, and feasibility studies in developing economies. Multi-development bank support for CCS is currently relatively limited, but there is potential to drive support through the Carbon Management Challenge and inclusion in national climate goals. The momentum in equity investments and mergers and acquisitions we've seen recently indicate diverse financing interest in CCS, including pension plans, infrastructure funds, venture arms of oil and gas companies, and private equity. Interest from such a diverse set of investors indicates the potential of CCS as a commercially viable decarbonisation technology. This may have positive implications for debt financing, which is generally not yet available for carbon capture and storage. Next slide, please. So now we'll step through some of the developments region by region, starting with the Americas. The Americas continue to lead the world in CCS facility deployment with 27 operating projects and 18 commencing construction across the United States, Brazil, and Canada. The United States has 19 facilities operating more than any other country. CCS deployment in the United States continues to be catalyzed once again by strong policy support. The bipartisan infrastructure law provides more than $12 billion to support carbon management and clean hydrogen hubs, of which funding for $10 billion has been awarded or is currently in negotiations. The Inflation Reduction Act increased the dollar value of tax credits for geological storage of carbon dioxide, lowered the carbon capture threshold to qualify for tax credits, and added provisions for direct pay and tax credit transferability. The credit level is now $85 per tonne of carbon dioxide captured and stored in dedicated reservoirs, and up to $180 per tonne of CO2 removed from the atmosphere through direct air capture with geological storage. The US is also requiring coal and new gas-fired power plants to capture 90% of their CO2 emissions by 2032, subject to some conditions around utilization. The queue of Class 6 injection well permit applications is robust and growing. The US Environment Protection Agency released a permit tracker dashboard that shows that there are 49 projects with 148 separate well applications under review across 15 states and 1 tribal nation. And in addition to that, 39 projects with 83 well applications under review by US states where they have the authority to grant those injection licenses rather than the US federal government. Finally, we're also seeing growing policy and investment support for voluntary carbon markets. In March, the US Department of Energy launched the Voluntary Carbon Dioxide Removal Challenge to increase voluntary purchases of carbon dioxide removal credits. We saw a rapid industry response to that with pledges or agreements to purchase CDR credits from the likes of Google, Microsoft, and AT&T. Next slide, please. In Canada, a combination of mandates and policies is driving project development. Canada's federally mandated carbon price increased to 80 Canadian dollars per tonne in April of this year. This will rise by 15 Canadian dollars per tonne annually, reaching $170 by 2030, with all provincial programs required to meet this federal benchmark. In June, the federal government released an investment tax credit for carbon capture utilisation and storage projects, covering up to 50% of the capital cost for projects, up to 60% for direct air capture projects, up until the year 2030. Canada's Growth Fund, announced in November of last year, can allocate up to 7 billion Canadian dollars for carbon contracts for difference to ensure a fixed minimum price for carbon, which of course assists the commerciality of our projects. Canada now has 7 operating CCS facilities, 5 in construction, and a further 46 which are advancing through studies. In Brazil, a CCS breakthrough occurred with the passage of the Fuels of the Future Bill. This provides the foundation for CCS-specific regulations in the country, making Brazil the first country in South America to develop such provisions. Additionally, Brazil continues successful CCS operations at its Santos pre-salt reservoirs, with 13 million tonnes of carbon dioxide injected in 2023 alone. Next slide, please. Across Asia, storage hubs and cross-border CCS projects are a major focus and a dominant trend in project development. Cross-border projects involve carbon dioxide capture in one country, which is then transported and stored in another. Nations with limited geological storage resources, such as Singapore, Japan, South Korea, are actively exploring opportunities with nations that have large storage resources, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, and Australia, to store their carbon dioxide. Governments across the region are laying the groundwork for CCS through new legislation, policies, and collaborative efforts. For early mover countries like Australia, the focus has been on strengthening existing regulations. The federal government passed a bill to allow the transboundary transport of carbon dioxide and has released a national action list for offshore carbon dioxide storage to meet its obligations under the London Protocol. On a project front in Australia, it's notable that Santos's Moomba facility is in final commissioning and is expected to announce commencement of operations before the end of this year. This will be Australia's second operating commercial CCS facility, in addition to Gorgon, which has already stored in excess of 10 million tonnes of CO2 to date. Several other jurisdictions in the region passed their first CCS regulations, plans, or policies since the last Global Status of CCS report. Indonesia released a presidential regulation providing a framework for CCS regulation. The regulation specifically provides for 30% of Indonesia's storage capacity to be used for imported CO2. Japan released its CCS Business Act and is exploring 9 candidate CCS networks. 5 would store CO2 in Japanese territory, and 4 are considering geological storage elsewhere, such as in Malaysia. Malaysia is expected to release CCS legislation later this year and is explicitly seeking to establish itself, as we just heard from the Minister, as a storage hub for Asia, looking at it as a long-term economic opportunity. South Korea announced its CCUS Act, which will be fully enacted in February of next year. The Act outlines processes around permitting, financial support mechanisms, and provides a framework for activities under operation, safety standards, and monitoring. Notably, all of this legislation released is considerate, makes provision for the transboundary transport of CO2. Simultaneously, collaboration is underpinning the various activities the public and private sectors are making to establish transboundary projects. Many memoranda of understanding have been or are being signed between countries as a necessary first step to allow projects to proceed with pre-FEED studies. Consortiums like the Shepherd CCS project, a public-private partnership between South Korean, Malaysian governments, and a number of private companies are helping connect the demand side to storage hubs. With all this activity in the Asia-Pacific region, project development in the region is starting to gather momentum. Excluding China, which is discussed later, there is now 1 facility in operation, 4 in construction, and 52 in studies in this region. In India, there is great potential and need for CCS, with 4 interministerial CCUS task forces collectively working on various aspects of CCUS, including safety and technical standards development. Although a number of challenges remain for this region across both regulatory and financial fronts, the amount of activity we've seen over the reporting period is certainly accelerating and is certainly encouraging. Next slide, please. This year, we've included a separate section in the status report for China, which highlights the strong progress China is making in CCS. The National Development and Reform Commission included CCUS in the implementation plan for Green and Low Carbon Technology Demonstration Program, a significant step marking the first time CCS projects will be supported with direct funding from the Chinese central government. In April, the Commission announced 6 CCS projects that it would support both through grants and other forms of low-cost finance. In July, China unveiled a plan to decarbonise its coal-fired power plants, aiming to reduce their emissions to match those of gas-fired plants in 3 short years by 2027, by co-firing with low-carbon ammonia or biomass, or by implementing carbon capture and storage, and all of this supported by policy measures and financial backing. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of CCS development in China is on the project front. Huaneng is on track to complete the world's largest integrated coal-fired power project with carbon capture and storage, with a capacity of 1.5 million tonnes per annum. In May, Xinjiang Oilfield, a subsidiary of the China National Petroleum Corporation, began construction of an even larger 2 million tonne per annum coal-fired power plant with CCUS project. China Building Materials Group is now operating the world's largest oxy-fuel project in the cement sector, with a capacity to capture 200,000 tonnes of CO2 per year. China also continues international collaboration. In late 2023, under the Sunnylands Agreement, the US and China committed to each having at least 5 large-scale cooperative CCUS projects by 2030, focusing on carbon capture from industrial and energy sources. China and France also launched the China-France Carbon Neutrality Centre, an initiative aimed at promoting research, technology transfer, and policy exchange related to carbon neutrality efforts between the 2 countries, an effort in which CCUS has received due attention. Next slide, please, Preeta. Across Europe and the UK, the impact of European decarbonisation policies is very evident. Europe now has 191 commercial CCS projects at various stages of development. 5 of those are operating and 10 of those are in construction. CCS has gained considerable importance through climate and industrial policy agendas in Europe and the UK. The European Union Industrial Carbon Management Strategy policy aligns with the European Commission's 2040 target and sets out a comprehensive policy approach to deliver against this target. The Net Zero Industry Act was introduced to drive investment in infrastructure. It mandates that European Union oil and gas producers collectively invest in 50 million tonnes per annum of CO2 injection capacity by 2030. The UK Green Growth Accelerator is a £960 million fund for CCUS, greenhouse gas removals, and hydrogen. And we will also applaud the recent UK government announcement, only earlier this month, I think it was, committing £21.7 billion to advance carbon capture projects over the next 25 years. Commercial agreements for 5 projects have now been concluded with the government, making FID on these projects imminent. This support is a very significant milestone for CCS scale-up across Europe. We've also seen the UK and European countries making significant progress in enhancing their CCS policy and regulatory networks. 9 countries, in addition to the European Union, have introduced or announced industrial carbon management strategies or roadmaps for carbon capture and storage deployment. A good example, of course, is the UK, which aims to establish carbon capture and storage in 4 industrial clusters by 2030, capturing and storing between 20 and 30 million tonnes per year of carbon dioxide. Germany, Austria, France, and Italy are refining regulatory frameworks to enable or facilitate scaling, and European governments are increasing collaboration on CCS. Of the more than 50 bilateral agreements between governments, national governments, related to CCS, 23 are between European nations. Industry-led initiatives also played a crucial role in promoting international collaboration. The surge in dedicated transport and storage project announcements in 2024, most of which have a cross-border dimension, is a very positive signal. This progress has been largely driven by European Union policies, such as the European Commission's selection of 14 of those cross-border carbon dioxide infrastructure projects on the list of projects of common interest and projects of mutual interest. On a project front, there have been several highlights. Transport and storage operations at the Northern Lights project out of Norway are scheduled to begin before the end of 2024. Of course, construction of the Porthos project in the Netherlands commenced in April of this year. The number of dedicated carbon dioxide transport and storage facilities in development in Europe reached 77, a doubling in a year compared to last year. But for the region to meet its decarbonisation and competitiveness objectives, more initiatives must reach their final investment decision and move towards and into construction. Next slide, please. The Middle East and African region now has 3 projects in operation and another 6 in construction. In the MEA region, where CCS was initially driven by enhanced oil recovery as it provided an economic incentive, we're now seeing a distinct shift to a focus on industrial decarbonisation and low carbon fuel development aligned with climate commitments. CCS policy development in the MEA region is advancing quickly. The Middle East and Africa are rapidly integrating CCS into their decarbonisation strategies, with countries like the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia outlining ambitious targets. The UAE's industrial decarbonisation roadmap and Saudi Aramco's increased CCS goal provide good examples of the region's commitment to leveraging CCS to achieve significant emissions reductions, especially in hard-to-abate sectors. Carbon markets too are being established to support CCS deployment, which include initiatives like the UAE's Air Carbon Exchange and Saudi Arabia's carbon crediting scheme. Collaboration, like in other jurisdictions, is at the fore of development in the MEA region. We are seeing this across the development of carbon markets, technology development, and various cross-border initiatives and projects. Companies like Saudi Aramco, ADNOC, and Oman's PDO are signing agreements to explore the development and adoption of new technologies. Notable projects include ADNOC's Habshan project, the 1.5 million tonne per annum CCS network, and Oman's pilot direct air capture initiatives in the Hajar Mountains. MEA countries are establishing CCS hubs with projects like the Jubail Industrial Hub, Sharjah's CCS Hub, and Bahrain's cross-border CCS value chain, positioning the region as a future leader in CO2 sequestration and carbon trading. In Africa, Egypt is progressing the identification of potential storage sites. A pilot project is being developed in South Africa with drilling of a well having been completed, and a direct air capture project has recently been launched in Kenya. Overall, the capture capacity of CCS projects in the pipeline in the MEA region is expected to exceed 65 million tonne per annum by the year 2035. Next slide, please, Peter. So in closing, I'd like to draw out just a few points from the report and today's presentation. The outlook is certainly looking positive for CCS, in fact, more positive than it's ever been. The 2024 Global Status Report highlights that the recognition of CCS as a critical decarbonisation tool continues to translate into concrete action with increasing policy support, new investments, and project deployments worldwide. But there remain challenges that must be overcome. Despite significant progress, headwinds remain. Difficult investment settings, community concerns, and regulatory barriers continue to be a brake on investment. And finally, collaboration is absolutely a key to success. CCS proponents must collaborate across sectors, borders, and technologies to overcome these challenges. We only have a quarter of a century until 2050, and the task at hand remains substantial. Governments, industry, and the research community must continue to work together to remove barriers, lower costs, and drive investment in this vital climate mitigation tool. Next slide, please. So that has been a very rapid and high-level overview of the 2024 Global Status of CCS report. You can download the report, the full report from our website, or you can use the QR code that you can see on your screen right now. But now I'd have the great pleasure of inviting our 3 panelists to please turn on their cameras so that we can start the discussion. Our panelists today are Rosie Johnstone. She's Head of CCS Solutions at GeoVault and Chair of Carbon Capture Utilisation Storage Network Australia. Scott Nielsen, a partner in A&O Shearman, a leading international law firm, and Takashi Hongo, who is a Senior Fellow at Mitsui & Co. Global Strategic Studies Institute. So we've just heard that the global operating capture capacity of CCS facilities around the world is on track to double over the next several years. Very positive outlook. But the CCS industry still faces significant challenges. Rosie, as a project developer here in Australia, I'd be interested to hear your perspectives around the opportunities and challenges for CCS.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so from an Australian perspective in terms of where the opportunities sit, so the last couple of years we've had the introduction of a what's called the safeguard mechanism, which is the ability to sort of cap point source emitters and to ask them to look for abatement solutions. And that's certainly been a piece of the puzzle that's unlocked an uptick in CCS project development. And we have those existing offshore regulations, and now increasingly across the onshore space in Australia, we have onshore regulations either ready or soon to be ready, and the federal government looking into that transboundary movement of CO2, so that piece of the puzzle as well. I think from the projects that are already up and running, we can see that where you have single source and single sink, so projects like Gorgon and Moomba, we're hoping that Moomba is going to announce any day soon that they're past the commissioning stage, that's the fastest and quickest way for us to sort of accelerate CCS projects. And also the opportunity in Australia is we just have a lot of pore space. So we have a variety of locations in lots of different places around Australia. So in the challenges side, I'd say where we're challenged, and I guess it's from the remarks from His Excellency Rafizi Ramali earlier, we can see that if you have a government that also is able to represent itself through a national oil company, that you can sort of embed your CCS as part of your sort of subsurface management. And Australia doesn't have a national oil company. And for those emitters in Australia who are process emitters, so ammonia, cement, etc., to meet the obligations under the safeguard mechanism, they will be incurring extra costs by decarbonising. But at the moment, we don't have a carbon border adjustment mechanism to sort of fit alongside that low carbon product. In the third party space, so getting away from the single source, single sink, there are a number of models that I think we'll see becoming worked out over the next little while. So will it be individual contracts, so the emitter, the storage, the transport people all sort of working together but under sort of individual contracts, or will we see more of those joint developments, so the forming of a JV between an emitter and a storage company to sort of run the whole piece together? So I'd say the last opportunity in that space then is the role of government. We certainly in Australia need the government to help us educate the public on the use case for CCS, rather than each individual project proponent trying to explain what it is and crucially what it isn't. We'd love to see both state and federal governments sort of play a role there in sort of making the case for reaching net zero targets with inevitably the use of CCS or CCUS. Now, whether that be under a hub model, which is a public-private partnership, whether the government plays a role in a sort of a contracts for difference, I guess we see that at Northern Lights, where the Norwegian government is sort of helping to align all the different pieces, or the UK government doing a direct injection of 21.7 billion. That's a game changer for those hubs in the UK. We just don't have any of that evident at the moment, but we're hoping that both state and federal governments are going to start to articulate their plans for that. And one last piece of that puzzle in a public-private sort of could be some sort of carbon take back, so an allocation of pore space for operating oil and gas companies with CCS to maybe take back some of the CO2. So there's a lot of movement in that space at the moment. So there's a lot of opportunity, but also some challenge.
Thanks very much, Rosie. Very comprehensive answer. I'd like to now switch to Hongo-san. So Hongo-san, we just heard from Rosie about the opportunities for new business models for CCS projects to be developed in this region, counterbalanced to some extent by the challenges associated most significantly with the commerciality of these projects being able to reach FID. Based upon what you just heard from Rosie, what do you see as the priorities to enable carbon capture and storage projects to proceed in the broader Asia Pacific region?
Yes, thank you very much. And also, first of all, I would like to say as the keynote speech said, the emerging economy in Asia and their energy demand is increasing, and the demand for energy is huge. So all option is needed, and I think the CCS is one of the important but indispensable option. But also we need to think about the kind of the barrier for accelerating or pushing the CCS in an emerging economy. There are many things, but I'd like to pick up two things. First one is of course, economics. So CCS revenue are generated by reducing CO2 emission. So the carbon price or carbon pricing is needed for commercialization of CCS. So fortunately, like Indonesia already adopted and implementing the emission trading. Malaysia is considering to adopting emission trading. So I think the carbon pricing in emerging economy in Asia, and that is good progress, and the investment climate is improving. And the second point is, but very important, and don't forget about it, public acceptance. We are talking about CCS here. I think that many of the people here are very much interested in and are supporting CCS. However, in general, particularly the people neighboring the CCS project site, they don't know much about CCS. What is the CCS? If unknown projects are coming to their area, they feel a kind of concern. So how to provide a kind of confidence on CCS. So sustainability of CCS is very important. And also some people strongly oppose CCS. This is the reality. So I think they are one of the two for having a good communication, improving the communication with these people is International Emission Trading Association high-level criteria for CCS. This consists of two parts. One is accounting, but the other element is sustainability. I think this is one of the examples how to improve, how to keep the communication with the people, particularly the nearby the project site. I think the public acceptance should not be forget about it for the having a CCS in it. That's all.
Oh, thank you, Hongo-san. I couldn't agree more strongly. I think early positive engagement with communities and the public to explain to them what CCS is, to hear their concerns, to respond to their questions is absolutely essential. We've seen projects cancelled in the past because of community concern, not just CCS projects, but in fact, any large industrial development. Good community engagement very early in the process is absolutely critical for those projects to proceed. And the point you made also about carbon pricing and the need for a policy environment that really makes that business case for making the investment, of course, very well made. Scott, I'd like to change the focus of the discussion a little bit. I mentioned in my presentation that the development of storage hubs and cross-border CCS projects are a major focus, particularly in this region in Southeast Asia. And I know that you have front row seats to some of these developments through your work in your firm. What do you think are the essential prerequisites for transnational CCS projects to proceed, and how are we tracking?
Thanks, Alex. I think the main prerequisites that we need at the moment are, sort of fairly simple in terms of, the categories, but they're not that easy to implement. And I mean, the first one, and it was touched on by His Excellency, the Minister Ramlee, in that there needs to be enabling legislation. As Hongo-san said, there is some legislation in Indonesia, but there needs to be a little bit more work done there underneath that on regulations and things. They've got a change of government, which will, factor into how that plays out and when. Malaysia's, as His Excellency said, is tabling legislation in November. That has to obviously then run through the Parliament, but that's a key factor. I think there's a lot of focus in Asia on those Malaysian hubs, and I'll come back to that in a second. Thailand also is in process, and East Timor is in process too on their legislation. And I think they're kind of like the main focuses at the moment for, in terms of storage beyond what's happening in Korea and Japan, which have limited storage. so that's enabling legislation, point one. I'd say point two is the bilateral agreements between the countries. And, you know, we understand that, for instance, the discussions between Japan and Malaysia and also Korea and Malaysia are ongoing. But those are needed to be able to actually ship the CO2, you know, from those countries down into Malaysian hubs, for instance. So, you know, we've seen them put in place in Europe. They've been light touched, but they're parties to the what's called the London Protocol, and in Asia that's not the case, and so there's a little bit more detail to work through in those. But we're hoping that those come through sooner rather than later, because we can't do it without them. I think the other one is also straightforward, but very hard, and that is either carbon pricing or you know, public sector support, or put simply subsidies. You know, I'd say there's been a game changer recently, and that game changer has been the advanced CCS program in Japan and the subsidies starting to flow there. And we're seeing work on those actively moving forward, which is exciting. In terms of what we're seeing in projects, I'll just touch on this very quickly. It falls into two categories: CCS attached to LNG projects, i.e., you know, what Tangguh is doing in Indonesia. There's another project in Indonesia working to do the same. You know, and there Tangguh is planning to put in place to capture the CO2 off their acid gas removal unit and put it back into the reservoir. And you know, that's the same approach being taken on the other project. They're not capturing the CO2 off the power unit, interestingly, but so they're really focused on their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, you know, to basically meet their net zero targets, but also, you know, eventually, because of, you know, things like the ETS in Japan, etc., which is coming into place. And then there's the hubs, and those are, for instance, in Malaysia. There's also one in Thailand that's going to be set up, but that's domestic. And those are starting to move forward, and taking a sort of a similar approach to what happened on Northern Lights or the Langskip broader project, in terms of needing heavy state subsidies in the first phase, and then broadening out to a more commercial phase with transportation and storage contracts. So that's a high-level overview, and I'll stop there. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks very much, Scott. So we do have a question now that one of our participants has posted, and the question really is around the risk of projects walking back. So the question is, you know, statistically, the number of projects, including development stage, is increasing. However, isn't there a sign of project retreat, like cancellations that we've seen across the green, the renewable hydrogen industry? So I guess initially I'll just observe that overall, the total capacity and the total number of projects in development is growing. So the net is certainly an increase, certainly this year compared to last year. And in fact, this year compared to every year going back to 2016, 2017. But I'm wondering whether any of the panelists can see some risks around, given some of the headwinds that CCS is facing, some risks around, you know, projects that are currently on the books being cancelled because they just can't advance. They can't get to the next stage of study, or they certainly can't get to FID, can't get to construction. What do you think the risks are that might drive that, and are we seeing evidence of that may not be reflected in those headline statistics that the Institute has collected and reported on? Who would like to have a first attempt at that? Scott? Yes, yeah. Please. Scott and then Rosie.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, at the moment, we're not seeing retrenchment, we're seeing advancement very clearly. And that's because we're coming off, frankly, a bit of a low base in Asia. I'll leave Rosie to comment on Australia. So I don't see that at all in this region. Yes, I see it in other regions because, for instance, in Europe, the permitting's, in America, the permitting's been an issue, as an example. But not here in Asia. I think it's very much everyone's now waiting for those subsidies to come through, and the advanced CCS ones have from JOGMEC. There needs to be a second phase of those because they're not full subsidies. And you know, really, we haven't seen that yet in Korea, for instance, as an example. That could boost activity there as well. But fundamentally, a lack of legislation in some of these countries could really affect projects. You know, for instance, in East Timor for Bayu-Undan, you know, they need environmental law plus CCS enabling laws. You know, timing and things like that could set them things back, and maybe companies sort of move focus if one jurisdiction is not ready on that side. You know, so let's wait and see. But I'll hand over to Rosie now.
Yeah, I'd say that the crucial difference between green hydrogen and CCS is that green hydrogen is still so early in the phase of sort of, you know, going from pilot scale to large scale to, you know, the whole network that needs to be built to support a hydrogen industry, let alone whether it's green or blue. Whereas for CCS, it's just a very known technology. So we're not having to face those constraints around how do you do this. We already know how to do all of the elements of it. And around the world, we have great examples of that. So I guess that the potential bottlenecks for going from that sort of large announced down through to the actual construction and injection phase will be dependent on, yes, subsidies. So the government models that are going to underpin this, because we're not creating a form of energy, we're creating a form of waste management. So obviously there's different commercial drivers between something you're going to sell as a product versus something where you're going to alleviate the problem for someone. So I think we'll crucially be stymied by, yeah, those commercial models and subsidies and the ways in which government can play, and then also public acceptance. So in Australia, some of the projects that have been cancelled, it's been due to the social licence. So we need to do a lot more in that area so that those announced projects can keep stepping through the funnel.
That's exactly the point that Hongo-san made earlier. Hongo-san, are you seeing a risk of project cancellations, project not advancing in the region? What are your views on that?
I think the one of the important and critical point is the stability and the continuity of policy support. So it's still very early stage, and the government support not only to the project implementation and also the R&D investment is needed. So the continuity of the government support is needed. So stop and go of the policy support, that is what's the case, how to keep the continuity. I think that is really important. Without the continuity and the stability of policy, company cannot continue to the business.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here. It's quite a lengthy one. I won't read it all out, but essentially the question is, if you make some assumptions, you can see a line of sight to about 0.5 gigaton of CO2 capture capacity being installed by 2030. And yet the modelling by the likes of the IEA and others indicates that we need about 1 gigaton, about double that by 2030, if we're to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees or close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, on top of every other technology being fully deployed successfully, right? CCS has only one small part to play, relatively small part to play. So the question is, you know, what are the bottlenecks essentially? What can be done to accelerate investment so that projects come on more rapidly and that capacity comes on more rapidly, and we achieve 1 gigaton or thereabouts by 2030 in order to meet climate targets? Hongo-san, maybe I'll start with you on that one. What are the bottlenecks and what can and should be done?
Yeah, I think one of the important support by government is infrastructure, and particularly the transportation and the sequestration. I think compared to the capture technology, rather mature stage. So if the government should concentrate on support to the capture side, and I think a kind of competition among the company in the field of the capture, such kind of the circumstances is needed. So I think the transportation, the sequestration should be the infrastructure that will reduce the risk of the investment to CCS.
Okay, thank you. Scott, do you have a view?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key point is really speed on the government side at this point, just to get in place that enabling legislation. I think there's also some fear around competitiveness of industry that was touched on before. You know, if someone moves and there's a cost to business, say in Japan, that the same cost is not borne in other jurisdictions, then are Japanese, you know, exports as competitive and things like that. So, you know, there's a lot of people waiting for the CBAM and in Europe and seeing how that flows out around the world. You know, but also, you know, the ETS is being implemented and the pricing being realistic, you know, is also a bit of a bottleneck. But even with the ETS pricing in Europe, I think it was about 75 euros at the time when they were doing Lungskip, you know, that wasn't enough to fund the project and they still needed subsidies. So definitely getting those subsidies in place. And as Hongo-san said, that continuity in supporting those subsidies through to seeing these projects through is very important.
Rosie, anything to add?
Yeah, just that any CCS project is a large infrastructure project. So, and
Yes.
when we're doing geological storage to understand the subsurface to the extent that we can satisfy the regulators that it's safe, just has a long timeline, so that we always have to allow for that ability to do all of the right work up front for CCS, build the models, assure the regulator. So to really sort of roll out projects quickly, we always have to factor in that sort of geological assessment time. And where possible, and again, this is a role for government, is to get ahead of, so you could sort of jointly fund that work on behalf of the government to do the right level of work, so that then a project proponent can take over rather than starting from scratch at that point.
Okay, thank you. Lots of questions coming in now, but unfortunately we only have a few minutes left to answer them. There's one question I'd like to finish off on, and that is around the finance, the massive finance that's going to be required, literally thousands, trillions of dollars of capital required for CCS globally. How do you see that progressing in Southeast Asia, where governments don't have the fiscal strength of, say, the United States, can't, you know, has many other priorities that are lower in that haven't yet fully developed. So how do you see that finance being made available in Southeast Asia to finance the CCS projects that need to be financed in order for Southeast Asian nations to meet their net zero targets? I'll just provide each of you maybe with 1 minute to give your thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up. So starting with you, Rosie.
Okay. Finance isn't my strong suit, but I'd certainly say that for those companies that are advanced already, so that the large emitter countries, so Japan, Korea, and the countries where they have the NOCs ready to go, I'd say it's inevitable that those projects will sort of pave the way, and then the other countries around the region will hopefully be able to sort of collaborate and learn from their experience.
Okay, thank you. Scott.
Unfortunately, finance is my strong point, and you know, particularly in Southeast Asia. So my answer to that is in exactly the same way as any other large infrastructure project in Southeast Asia has gone ahead. You know, and that has been predominantly with Export Credit Agency support from the countries that are investing in it. You know, if you've got Korean investors or Japanese investors, that's people like JBIC, Nexi, Kexum, K-Shore, you know, funding these projects together with commercial banks. I'd say that's the number one, going to be the number one source. And, you know, they're ready to do this. Our job is to present bankable projects to them, you know, which is why I'm involved in some of these projects, you know, up front. Also, entities like the Asian Development Bank will be key in this region. So, you know, I'd say that those are the primary funding sources, of course, other than, you know, it's going to be funded by equity, maybe subsidies, these kinds of things as well. So, but on the hard bank kind of, you know, ECA financing side, that's where it'll come from.
Great, thank you, Scott. Hongo-san, where do you think the money will come from?
Yeah. So I also work for the bank, and in my experience, previous experience, we need to think about two things. First one is revenue itself. So the carbon pricing is enough to cover the whole cost. So revenue boost is necessary, and also the one more important thing, risk sharing. So for financer, is if they ask you to provide the finance to the whole value chain of CCS, capture, transportation, and sequestration, it's a really difficult task for them. So they how to set a kind of segmentation. So the capture side, transportation, and sequestration divided into 3 segments, and each of the risks should be covered by the project companies. The capture side is covered by the capture company, etc. Such kind of risk sharing scheme is needed. That is my experience.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that's been an excellent discussion in a very limited time. Sadly, we're out of time, and I really must draw this webinar to a close. So thank you very much to Rosie, to Hongo-san, and to Scott for making yourselves available for this session and sharing your insights so generously with us. As I mentioned earlier, I've only had time really to share a very high-level overview of the global status of CCS report on this webinar. It contains a wealth of information. And I encourage everyone to visit our website or use the QR code that you can see on the screen now to download the report and read it at your leisure. This session's been recorded. We'll be putting it on our website in the coming days. So if you want to watch it again, please feel free to watch it again or share it with your colleagues. Lastly, of course, we do appreciate you sharing any tweets, comments, etc., related to the Global Status Report on your social accounts. If you do, we encourage you to use the hashtag Global Status 2024. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. That draws the webinar to an end. Goodbye.